Tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And thank you also for your patience with us while we worked out some last minute technical difficulties. My name is Joe Bass. I'm the student ambassador at the Architects Climate Action Network. And I'm also a co-director of this year's StuCAN Festival. I'm delighted to be welcomed here tonight by the GSA to have a fantastic panel of speakers who we will announce. My colleague will announce Meha shortly. But we were really keen to do this evening and work with the GSA to situate our weekend festival, which is happening tomorrow and on Sunday at Civic House, just down the road from here. The Students' Climate Action Network is the student wing of ACAN, and we work to empower students to improve climate literacy across the UK and beyond. And so it's events like this, and especially our festival, which bring together students from across the UK island and internationally together in one place to celebrate ideas and specifically for this, embrace this theme of reciprocity and entanglement. I'd first like to just welcome on Salih Stewart, who is the head of the school at the Glasgow School of Art, just say a word or two about the school. But once again, we're really grateful to be hosted tonight by you.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to get a clap before you've even said anything. So I am the head of the Mackintosh School of Architecture, not the head of Glasgow School of Art, so a little correction there. But being head of Mackintosh School of Architecture is enough. So thank you very much for coming here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome StuCAN. Thinking about it, I think that ACAN and StuCAN, rather than being organisations you should join, I think they should be organisations that you should be automatically joined, rather like a kidney donor card and you have to opt out. Climate literacy is so important for the future that nobody should not be exposed to this, be included in this. So we're really delighted to have you here in Glasgow and be able to support you in any way. And it's something that's really at the heart of what we do in the school. It's incredibly important in our teaching to try and ensure that students now are supported to investigate, explore and understand any ways that they can approach understanding the impact that we have on the climate as architects now in your designs as students and in the future. It's also very nice to have the subject of entanglements for the weekend. It made me think of Merlin Sheldrake's book on fungi and how the more you find out about entanglements, the less you understand, the less you realise the importance of the individual and more you understand how together we get things done and we can change conventions. So I hope that's going to be your experience of entanglements over this weekend. So thank you very much, and you're very welcome at GSA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salih. I'd now like to introduce one of my fellow co-directors for the StuCAN Festival, part of our team of 12 volunteers who are students, architecture assistants and graduates, Meha Patel, choreography, who will be the chair of tonight's talk and holding the panel debate afterwards. Thanks so much, Meha.
Thank you, Joe. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Meha, and I'll be introducing the festival. I will quickly go through ACAN and StuCAN, but Joe's kind of touched on that, so I'll keep it brief. And then we will go through the concept of entanglement as an introduction to this weekend. Thereafter, we'll have our keynote speakers, and we'll have a panel in which you'll be able to ask questions, so please bear that in mind while you're listening. A little introduction about me is I'm one of the festival co-directors, and I first joined StuCAN through my local uni StuCAN chapter, which was Bath Climate Action Group. I initially did comms and then moved on to coordination, and then also alongside that did programming in StuCAN. Okay, so ACAN is a network of individuals and organisations within architecture related to the built environment. and we take action to address the twin crises of climate and ecological breakdown. There are 3 clear aims, which are decarbonise now, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation. The climate action initiatives are carried out by the thematic groups, which you can see on the screen, and it covers a wide range of topics, and they're always looking for new groups and members. There'll be a link later on where you can join the WhatsApp group for those. So StuCAN, which is what we're all here for, it was set up in 2021 by the Architects Climate Action Network, and it works to unite and empower students and graduates across the UK and beyond. As the future generation of built environment professionals, we are all acutely aware that we'll be designing within the context of climate and ecological crises. However, many of us do not feel prepared for that. Despite some changes, there has been a huge disparity between what students are taught, and the reality is that majority of us are still being taught to design for a planet that will no longer exist. The Students' Climate Action Network was formed to change this, to unite students and graduates across the UK and beyond, empowering them to collectively change their environment and to connect them with the professional industry. We do this through a huge range of events. So we had the StuCAN competition this year, we've got the festival today and this weekend, and various socials and workshops that happen on a more local level. If you feel like you aren't prepared to design for our future planet, then StuCAN offers a community of students, graduates, and professionals that are taking action, and you'll have fantastic opportunities to learn and meet like-minded climate advocates. Over the past year, we've grown across the UK and internationally. Our 4 most recent groups are Sligo in Dublin, located in the Republic of Ireland, Virginia Tech all the way in America, and the Chalmers University in Sweden. There are, however, almost 70 schools of architecture in the UK and Ireland, so we're still expanding our network to support, inspire, and upskill students. To find out how you can get involved, join StuCAN, which is that QR code over there. You'll also get access to the ACAN thematic groups, so I would highly recommend joining. If you have a local StuCAN chapter, also join that. If you're studying here at the GSA, then the Mackintosh are looking for more students. And if you don't have one, then please get in touch with us on one of those links at the bottom, and we can provide you with some resources to start. Okay, on to the festival. So, why are we here? I'll start off by reading our theme brief that we sent out. So, Entanglement invites participants, which is all of you, to explore reciprocity in the built environment through the more than human relationships we share on a global and local scale. We want to inspire discourse, learning, and unlearning about how we situate ourselves and design within the complexities of our shared planet towards a climate-positive future. So, what exactly is entanglement? The first thing that came to my mind was the Wood Wide Web. So, beneath the soil on a forest floor, you'll not only find trees and plant roots anchored deep into the ground, but also a whole host of organisms like worms, bacteria, and mycorrhizal networks, which is basically fungi, that stretch far and wide. Under your feet are complex webs that work symbiotically to sustain life. Trees and plants turn solar energy into nutrients, which are then stored in roots. Worms turn and aerate the soil and improve the structure and nutrient quality, which better sustains the plants. Mycelial networks connect those trees and plants together and can even transfer nutrients from sick trees to healthy trees, from healthy trees to sick trees, sorry. These are all components that are entangled with one another and live in reciprocity and symbiotically. So, reciprocity was actually the starting thought for this festival, and that's where it emerged from. At its very simplest, it can be understood as if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In this context, it stretches far beyond simply returning a favor, but rather returning a gift, which is a concept from one of my favorite books, Braiding Sweet Grass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I would highly, highly recommend reading that. Gifts are something given without the expectation of return. So the idea of returning the gift therefore stems from gratitude and the idea that giving back is one of care. The earth provides us with life and resources, and in return, we have a responsibility to care for the earth. Part of that responsibility is shifting away from trying to extract and accumulate as much wealth and resource as possible. Donut economics is a great way of visualizing this, where in order to maintain a safe and just space for humanity, we must be above a social foundation, but below the ecological ceiling. Therefore, we'll thrive in a regenerative and distributive economy. Okay. Another part of reciprocity is about looking at the more than human. This quite literally entails moving away from human-centric views and considering entities beyond that. In design, 99% of the time of our clients are other humans, especially in architecture school. And the consideration for biodiversity is often brief, or added at the end without much thought. When looking at the more than human, we need to consider species, beings, entities, and systems beyond just people. Right now, many people live separately to nature, and nature is seen as something that is other. Part of reciprocity, more than human, and even regenerative design is understanding that humans play an active role in ecosystems. An example of this is pearl farming on an island in French Polynesia. Instead of using chemicals to clean oysters, they started arranging lines in a way that allowed fish to feed on the algae, which both cleaned the oysters and provided a food source. This has been so impactful that the biodiversity of the ocean area has dramatically bloomed, and fish are now venturing further into the sea following those lines. Regenerative design has been defined as creating self-evolving, net-positive solutions that renew our unity with nature. This is a definition taken from the Renew Centre of Regenerative Design at the University of Bath. And I love this definition because it specifies unity with nature, which implies that we are sort of one with nature rather than in a relationship, which suggests more than one. We are not just observers of nature, but rather active participants. You can probably see a pattern emerging. Reciprocity, more than human, and regenerative design, though all slightly different, they all have intersections and overlaps, and this is what we mean by entanglement. Understanding how systems, beings, and entities are interwoven. It is important to understand that the built environment and climate justice don't exist in a silo. Buildings occupy physical land, which influences local ecosystems and the more than human. Land also has social and political implications, which then leads to spatial justice conversations. Materials that are mined or harvested create other landscapes or destroy them. Labor is also required to source materials and to construct, and the list could go on and on. Climate change also disproportionately affects marginalized communities based on intersecting identities like race, gender, class, and ability, and climate action encompasses advocating for solutions that address these inequalities. Climate justice is about providing equitable solutions to social issues just as much as it is about mitigating the ecological impacts of climate change. During this weekend, we will be diving into 3 themes around entanglement, and those are land and community, materials and circularity, and technology and futures. However, these are not set categories. I encourage you to discuss and map out the links between what you've learned and create your own webs of learning. And to paraphrase Indy Johar, you are not an observer of entanglement, but rather an active participant working from within. I will now briefly introduce our keynote speakers. So first, Becca Thomas will be speaking on regenerative practice. Becca is a director and architect at Scotland-based New Practice, working on socially connected projects with a people-first approach. Following this, Hani Salih will be speaking on policy and governance. Hani is a curator, writer, and researcher currently based at Design Museum's Future Observatory. Last but not least, Blanche will be speaking on student-led, staff-supported projects and how nature-based solutions can be brought to campuses. Blanche is an associate professor at environmental design at the Bartlett and created the Greening Cities module, which focuses on nature-based solutions in design. I would now like to hand over to Becca.
Can we get that full screen control, I think? I think it might be...
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Perfect.
I actually don't know why I brought my notebook up here because I forgot to bring my notes. So we're going to go a bit off piece with this one and see where it takes us over the next kind of 20 minutes. I wanted to speak about how we build our built environment and acknowledge that I think something that everyone in this room is well aware of, that architecture is inherently destructive. There's nothing that we do as architects that is not destructive in some way, shape or form. Whether we build like this, with as light a touch as we can manage in, you know, beautiful natural landscapes, or whether we build like this and kind of pretend that we're green and that we're eco. I think both of them, to some extent, lie about what they're doing and how green they are, how good they are, if we want to give it that metric. Whatever we do, we are turning natural landscapes that are interconnected, the Wood Wide Web, these landscapes built up and grew together. Whatever we do, we take some version of this and we modify it, we change it. We've been doing this for millions of years. Since humans existed, we've been turning spaces that perfectly well exist. I'm really sorry for the quality of that image of farm. We've been turning spaces that existed and coexisted with different life forms in it into something that we manage. And that's how we understand land. That's how we understand buildings. That's how we talk about the built environment. It's something that we can manage and control. So we've always done that. When we were building like this, we're doing that. When we're building in the high-tech way we build now, we're doing that. But part of what I think we all do as people working in the built environment, as architects, as designers, is we imagine futures. And we get to imagine... I'm going to show you something that I pulled out of an archive. I was asked to do this talk before COVID on imagining futures and writing a postcard to the future of this city. I'm not going to talk to it very much, other than that I think it's a good snapshot of a way to imagine a future. So we can imagine futures as good. This actually, because I was asked to do that, I went and spoke to some of my friends, because that's what I love to do when I'm thinking about how we build spaces. And some of my friends were really, really positive, and they wanted lots of lovely stuff for Glasgow. And some of my friends are really negative, and they came up with this pessimistic view of the future that was pretty dark and dismal. And this is actually just a direct quote from a WhatsApp message I got one night from a friend after we'd had this conversation. And he had been talking about how he thought it would be a bad future, but he couldn't articulate it. And then I woke up to this WhatsApp message, which is really, really a lot to deal with at 1 a.m. But I think what we're talking about futures, we get to imagine a future that can have a bit of both. We get to understand that we exist in late stage, end stage capitalism. We are all doing good work within that, but how do we keep pushing ourselves to make sure we meet the good end of that diagram, that image, that thought process, and not exist in this pessimistic, potentially quite horrible view of the future? And so that brings us to regenerative design. What do we mean by regenerative design? What do we mean by being sustainable? Often we see it mapped out like this, right? We're environmentally sustainable, we're socially sustainable, we're economically sustainable. We touch the ground lightly, we consider what we're doing, you know. We balance our cost and our quality, we think about operational sustainability. And the one that I think gets left out a lot, and the one where I probably do the most active work, is in social. Thinking about people. And that doesn't go far enough. I think Mia happily gave me the beginning bit of this, which is that doesn't go far enough. That while we talk about social and cultural sustainability, it's not quite the right thing. But that is where I have built a practice. So over the past 15 years, we've tried to build a practice that meets some of those goals and tries to exceed them where we can. with an emphasis on community, on placemaking in the good way, not in the way that I find that word can be bandied about often, with kindness and with collaboration. It's about being flexible and understanding the limits of what we can do, but where we can really expand our goals. Sometimes it looks like this, which is a project in Edinburgh that we did. It's actually, what you can't see here is behind all of these walls, there's actually a huge, great big green space. It's just really difficult to photograph well. But that's a biodiversity-led, SUDS-led project, largely. It's actually all the funding comes from urban design and nature-based solutions. And then we got to put this funny little beacon sculpture on the front, and it's got some commercial space in this little unit. But this is about taking space that was previously derelict, was previously the kind of beacon of quite a lot of antisocial behaviour and over-policing I found in this community, and turning that completely on its head. It's got one of the things I'm proudest of ever building, which is that I managed to sneak past a local community client, or a local authority client, that what we've actually built is a stage for teenagers to go and hang out and drink illicitly in. And they don't know that that's what that's for. They think it's a stage for doing performances for market festivals and things. But actually, it's got a far greater human purpose, which is to really give a space to a group that I think are largely maligned in the public. Sometimes it looks like having conversations over good food. And wine, and doing song, and trying to understand the different positions that we're all starting from. So this is a project I did in Venice, right at the beginning of my career, and at the end of this night, I fell in the canal. So it was a really good night. And sometimes it looks like taking that conversation into different contexts and trying to understand, or trying to bring clients who would not necessarily want to hire regenerative practice, get them to think about regenerative practice starting from a social sustainability perspective. These are some lovely projects we've done. And sometimes it looks like trying to ungreenwash some greenwashing. So this is a project we did for for COP at Sustainable Glasgow Landing. And this project was one of those ones where we got told to do net zero with no waste and 8 weeks on a site that was over a hectare big. And it had to invite 10,000 people to the site to talk about the future and the wonderful future of the environmental sustainability that we could all manage, all these new technologies. And the only ways, I think, in which to unpick something like that is to try and start from the very beginning and try and figure out, what did they think they were doing with sustainability? How did they think, number one, that we could meet those high ideals? But also, how did they want me to measure that and tell them that we'd done it? Because we weren't going to lie. So what could we do that would start to unpick some of their goals, and also meet what I think was really important in this project was, again, a local authority client working for a big national, it's not a festival, what would we call COP? What would we call COP? COP. But the kind of, lots of important delegates buzzing around Glasgow, but there was very little space for that activist conversation. And the activist conversations here were vital. So trying to create space within this sanitized site for activist conversations, for very difficult conversations. And we actually ended up hosting, I think, Tuvalu's only presentation at COP in Glasgow, which was they came and did a film here, but they weren't invited into the main campus. They weren't allowed to share that information there, but at least here they could show it to as many people as came by on a 10 a.m. on a Thursday. It was a really wonderful film that they looked at in terms of, kind of sea level rise and what to do. But again, I think working within practice is trying to understand how far we can push it within these spaces to make sure we're meeting our own ideals and also questioning where we can. These are more examples. But I think the big thing that I think about when I think about regenerative design or sustainable design is how all of the work we're doing is part of someone else's story, or many other people's story, many other things, many other objects' stories. And that largely comes back to the fact that as an architect, I rarely, if ever, build anything new. And I love that. So someone asked me recently if I had a particular thought on a facade design, and I was like, I can't remember the last time that I drew a facade, because normally they come on the outside of the buildings that I'm working on. So I'm going to quickly visit a project that I'm really proud of and I think meets all of my goals for what I think we should be doing in practice. This is a community project, so again, going back to that activist point, this project is started by activists. It exists because of activists, and it actually exists because of one woman called Helen, who got really annoyed that they closed down her community centre. So it's in an old school building, it's a beautiful building, but very simple, and also in a community in the south side of Glasgow that doesn't have a lot of other spaces. Helen got really mad. She used the centre for her childcare. She lives next door. She still lives next door. And she decided that at the point where it was told it would close, she was going to just stay in the building until they gave her the keys. And she wasn't going to leave. And then she recruited some friends and some more friends. And eventually they had a huge community group who sat in the building for 55 days and nights, whilst also organising protests all across the city and generally making a big dance and noise. And at the end of that, they were given the keys, I think mostly to shut them up and make them go away or be quiet. And then they were left to it. So they then have a building. It's run by the community. It's managed by the community. It's doing all the things a community building needs to do, but it's falling apart around their ears. There's water leaking in every possible space in that building, and it's generally kind of being run down in a long managed space of, if you let it run down long enough, eventually they'll want to leave, and then we can get on with building the new housing that we wanted to build here 20 years ago. Again, another terrible photo, but this is the day after a couple of years of working with them where they succeeded in purchasing the building off the local authority and off Glasgow's city properties, and beginning the process of turning that into a building that functioned. So a huge part here is, what is the role of an architect here? Because actually the thing I get congratulated for most by the people who use this building is the fact that I removed these tarpaulins and there is no longer a need for them. But just making it not rain inside is a really, really low bar for architecture. It's also a really low bar for the sorts of conversations that we could be having around operations, around what do they want to be, who did they want to invite into the space. How did they want to maintain all of this wonderful activism and character that they had in the building whilst it was falling apart, but without, and how could we stop architecture sanitizing it? Because that's what we do. We control it. Go back to that point. We destroy these things and control them. I did destroy this ugly monkey. I'm sorry. I'm not actually sad about that. But so how do we go about keeping these spaces looking and feeling like they belong to people, belong to their place, and also make them function? This is one of those moments when you walk in. I was doing a review of the building, and I hadn't seen in this room for a really long time because it had a tenant in it. And I walked in and I was like, yes, these are my people. I am in the right space to be doing this architecture because our values and our vision for this space totally aligns. And what I enjoyed was this got left on the wall, and when the contractor came in, who was largely, as you would imagine, they looked at it and they were just like, what do we do with this? And I was like, well, I mean, eventually you're going to paint it because this wall needs to be a different colour. But for the moment, you could just leave it. And then eventually I found other scribbles on it, which were far less nice. Other graffiti got added to the bottom. But this space of that completely threw them, but made me feel very welcome in this building. So yeah, we ended up doing a renovation, actually quite a traditional piece of architecture for me. But it was all focused on conversation and understanding priority and trying to turn this, which is their mind map of things that they could do, into something more manageable and actually deliverable and fundable over there. So again, this is me doing control, but it's again about not just the control of the space, but also a control of how we get to that point and how we understand what we're going to deliver, and that we can deliver it and get to the outcome that everyone needs. And we did some nice drawings. But also we thought about how we use buildings and how we reuse buildings. So I know this is not a beautiful material passport, but it is the start of doing material passports in spaces like this. Kidding Park, as an organisation, had always done the most they could with the least they had. And this is us taking that approach as architects. What can we relocate? What can we reuse? What can we rehang? What can I stop a contractor kicking, and so that we can keep it and reuse it in a different part of the building. That was actually a huge problem for me. I don't think there's enough training with builders about what they can do in terms of this role. And so we built it. There's all the toilets that we got to keep. That's good. And this was a journey that we went on thoroughly with the client. So this is Rachel, who was the building manager, as part of the client team the whole time. And we spent a lot of time arguing about whether we kept the notches in the banisters or whether we got rid of them. How did we add back into the building? How did we keep it feeling and looking like itself? And now it's open. And it's been open for about 3 years. I know, exactly 3.5 years, because it's the same age as my child, because I was very pregnant when we handed this building over. But the space itself hasn't changed that much. We've got rid of some tarpaulins, and we've got rid of some ugly boxing out that was not required. But predominantly, this is an exercise in kind of architectural restraint, and trying as much as possible to put the building back the way the building should be, not worrying about how I'm going to feel as the project architect. We used colour in here quite carefully. There are different coloured floors. You have a yellow floor at the top. This is the pink floor. And the bottom floor is green. And that is because a large number of the people who use this building don't read English very well, or have other kind of literacy concerns. But you can send them to the right colour. Go and find the pink hall, and off you go. And it's much easier and doesn't rely on the sort of accessibility. So it's about how do we think about inclusivity and accessibility going way, way beyond buildings and ramps. So for me, and for this theory of kind of, I guess entanglement, I think of as regenerative in its underpinning. But it's how do we work to make better futures? Oh, gone the wrong way. And how do we as architects and designers consider ourselves with more than aesthetics, with more than these kind of self-indulgent conversations? And how do we use architecture as an activist tool by working within communities and around other people who are doing really solid, really good work? And that is me.
Thank you so much, Becca, for that. That was a lovely presentation. I'd now like to invite Hani up. Of course. This one?
Yeah. Oh no! Just enable, because that's the fingers.
Yep.
No.
Okay, lovely.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing? Sorry, I'm not going to do crowd work. So, hi, my name is Hani. I'm excited to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about something incredibly exciting, which is planning policy and heat pumps. So, strap in. I'm going to do my best to try to make this as engaging and interesting as possible. Primarily, I'll be talking about the research that I've been doing over the course of the last year at the Design Museum, where I was a design researcher in residence. So, I'm going to take you through it, and let's go. So, my main question was really try to understand how do we actually understand the context that we practice in as architects, as design practitioners. I think that in that sense, we think that we design based on a brief, but that brief is also deeply informed by a series of social, political, and economic contexts. And so I was particularly interested in the planning context. So started out with this question: how do we navigate the decision-making systems that are full of complexity and contradiction? And really, that's quite a big question. So I had to simplify it into three sort of sub-questions. The first one is, how is policy currently made? This is more for me to understand how things are going. And then how does the current mechanisms for decision-making actually contradict each other? If I'm talking about starting from a position of it being contradictory, how does that actually work? And then the last one is there another way to make decisions? Sort of more open-ended, speculative attempt at trying to understand or imagine an alternative. The residency's theme that this year, well, last year now, is artificial. And so each of us as residents had to define how we relate to the theme of artificial. And I sort of started with this quote from Alistair Parvin. Alistair Parvin, if any of you are interested in any of the stuff, I would thoroughly recommend checking out. He's a brilliant sort of thinker, former architect as well, and is just doing a lot of work around planning policy and how we can do these things differently. So he has a lot of writing, but one of the quotes that really stuck with me is the idea that he says, mud is a natural structure, but land is a social structure. So I position my project from the premise that actually the idea of the way the planning system works at the moment, it still has its roots deeply tied around the concept of ownership, of land ownership. And so the notion of land ownership and the notion of enclosure is actually a very artificial concept. You know, nature does not understand what enclosure is. There's no idea about ownership from that context. And so that was kind of how I started that conversation. And that very quickly led me to feudalism, of course, where the system of ownership of land was really a way of gaining power. You know, you own land, you were able to leverage that as a way to, you know, do something, you know, be it sort of extract surplus resources from the land through the form of food and labor, or sort of extort people underneath you to go to fight wars for you. Anyway, so thinking a little bit further, today, you know, headlines like this are headlines that I keep kind of seeing. I think in the last 15 to 20 years, we've always, every sort of major political campaign, electoral campaign, should I say, has always been talking about wanting to change or reform the planning system. When it comes to thinking about how we might address issues such as, you know, housing shortage or climate change, we're always talking about the planning system as being the bottleneck. So that's kind of where I kind of landed on that angle. And so that sort of leads me to the first question. How is policy actually currently made? I'm going to have to try and do a lot of shortcutting because I don't have a huge amount of time, and I'm not going to put you through the details of these things. But I sort of decided to look at the NPPF as a starting point. The National Planning Policy Framework is a document that the government sets out its priorities about what gets built where and how and when and what quantity. It's a very gestural document. It's about 180 pages, and a lot of local authorities use that as a way to sort of make decisions, and being very simple here, make decisions about the things that happen in their local area. So I started by basically drawing that out in a very crude diagram, right? So this is kind of how, very roughly at the beginning of my research, I conceptualized that relationship. So, you know, if you want to, as a developer or as anyone who wants to build anything, if you need to apply for planning permission, that sort of has relationships that always lead up to the National Planning Policy Framework through either sort of checking or cross-referencing against that. So for my first question, I wanted to actually understand how this works and how does something actually become a line item in the NPPF? How are you able to influence national policy as an individual, as an organization, as an architect, as a designer? This is a bit of a jump scare, but this is kind of what it looks like. So this was an attempt, and I've tried to be as accurate as possible, but tried to map the roots into how we make decisions. You know, what are the avenues that we can use, both as members of the public, but also as sort of members of the electorate, and how does that actually feed into how things work? And this was a result of a few series of interviews with public sector workers and sort of senior civil servants. To try and actually map this, because I couldn't find any of this information online. Most of it I had to kind of cobble together through interviews and again through some rough-handed diagramming. But to distill it, to me, it seemed like the problem of policy and decision-making in this country boils down to most ministries have areas of oversight, and these ministries are highly siloed. They have their own internal hierarchies, they have their own internal structures. As someone, they all have their own levels of complexity too. But as someone who wants to do something, be it build a house or think about putting together, like a massive infrastructure project, let's say like something called HS2, you would have to actually deal with multiple different elements, different silos. And so the problem actually tends to be in the gap between the silos. It's the lack of communication, it's the lack of flow. So there's almost like a vacuum or a chasm in these to speak simply, in these kind of silos. So that's as far as I'll go with that. The next question, how do current decision-making system mechanisms actually contradict each other? So for this, I was trying to understand, I was speaking to someone early on in my research, and I was thinking about which case study should I choose? And the main sort of criteria was to prove how complicated and contradictory a system is. Actually, sometimes you just have to try and get through it. Is it actually easy to get through? And heat pumps was the main one, but I'll get a little bit more about that later. So the context when I started this residency was coming off relatively fresh off of Labour's new election into Parliament. And they had this promise, which they said, we're going to build 1.5 million new homes in the next 5 years. I'm not getting into how ridiculous that is as a promise, because there's no point. But in order to do that, it's really a question of housing delivery. So you'd think it's like this, right? You want to build homes, you go straight to housing delivery. Unfortunately, that's not how government works. You have all these different actors, right? Some of them are actors, some of them are documents, some of them are references, some of the things that you have to relate to, some things you have to use in order to be able to do things. So in reality, it actually kind of looks more like this, or actually like this. And so, I mean, this is, when I saw the theme Entanglement, this is kind of the diagram I was thinking about. So in reality, actually, my sort of main point around this is that national government can set aims, it can set broad targets, but the problem is, you have issues around systemic bandwidth. Can the system, can the planning system, can the decision-making system, can the policy mechanisms actually deal with this with this information, be it for action or to just kind of sit with it? But then also, there's an issue with local capacity. Local planning departments, local teams sometimes don't have the knowledge or the resource. And that's kind of a thing that kept coming up in my research. And so, hopefully this will work. Is it playing? Okay, I might have to just press play. Oh, sorry. A new point in a video was a bad idea. Okay.
Millions will be feeling the impact of an unprecedented rise in the cost of energy this morning as bills increase by the largest amount in living memory.
Another 2 energy suppliers in the United Kingdom have gone out of business, caused by the huge increase in the cost of gas. Combined with other recent failures, it means that 1.5 million people are now facing a switch to a new, more expensive firm.
In less than 30 years' time, the UK should be a net zero country, putting nothing into the atmosphere which would make climate change worse. That's the target that the government has set out today.
The market is going green. And they know that we'll be able one day to bring down the prices of green technology, EVs and heat pumps and solar panels, in a way that we so rapidly made microwaves and mobile phones affordable.
Plans to end the sale of new gas boilers in the UK by 2035. Grants of £5,000 will be given to help households switch to heat pumps. Would you consider replacing your existing boiler with a heat pump? And what else are you doing around your home to reduce your carbon footprint?
So that was just a kind of attempt to try and contextualize the reasons behind choosing heat pumps. And I think this diagram is probably a more efficient way of communicating it. I think that when I was trying to figure out what case study I should be looking at, I was trying to understand the issues that are probably most pertinent. I mean, there's many, but maybe let's say 3 that are most pertinent to the kind of future of planning, future of architecture, future of society, let's say. For me, the 2021 to 2023, roughly, energy crisis, which was some of the news clips kind of showed, was a real turning moment in how people thought about energy. Not just I think it's also almost like the shot across the bow when it comes to what reality of climate change looks like, what an increasingly fractured geopolitical context we're sitting in will actually look like in terms of how it touches our lives. And then complicated planning policy, of course, that was always going to be there. But actually, how do we deal with the climate crisis from a more structural perspective? And so for me, heat pumps sit right at the middle of that. But it's really important as part of this research to say that I also wanted to make sure that I was looking at the human aspect. So I found, as part of my research, I managed to line up I managed to shadow an installation process for a heat pump, the system that was going in locally to the design museum. And so it was really interesting getting to speak to people about their experiences of navigating the system and actually getting a human angle, because as much as I love diagrams, actually people are still experiencing those things and trying to get through them because they're trying to do good and try to manage energy. Okay, so the videos are not always working. Okay, cool. I'm going to move on. But another aspect of that was also doing a lot of user journey mapping. How do people actually, what does it look like when someone tries to get a heat pump installed, right? I should explain what a heat pump is, just in case who knows what a heat pump is in here? Oh, great. Okay, right, okay. That's about 50%, just if you don't ask the person next to you. This is the church, which actually has some clips from a film that I made as part of the residency. to kind of show the installation process, but I also interviewed a lot of people as part of this because, again, user experience was an important aspect of understanding how does this work, what isn't working, and again, this is the point of like managing understanding how complicated and contradictory the system is. So you can either have a journey like this, where, I mean, the last box says the system was up and running by the end of 2025, February 2025. It was, but it needed a bit more tweaking, so it wasn't running until about April. But then you can also have something like this, where someone just goes, I want to get a heat pump in. They don't have to go through planning. They can just get it installed. So I think this level of difference is also a big problem because it means that there's a lot of uncertainty around what happens. And with these things, there's always a lot of tight turnaround times and a lot of external factors that you could actually be at the mercy of, let's say. So, I mean, Nesta had, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Nesta, but Nesta is an organization that has been doing a lot of work around, one of their missions has been trying to accelerate the transition towards green energy. And so they've really been focusing on heat pumps. And so they've done some user experience mapping of a potential scenario. And so this was really helpful for me to kind of understand and build on, because the residency wasn't a huge amount of time. So I didn't have a lot of time to do primary research. Looking at things that already existed and talking to people who have already been through the journey was part of it. But I then ended up basically mapping this, but with more detail based on the research I've done. And I'm just going to show it. This is kind of what it looks like. And the thing about mapping something like this is that there's many factors that could influence. So you have to try and include those. But then also, to be honest, by the time this went to print for the exhibition, it was already out of date. And so this is the thing that we have to contend with, you know. And I think the really important thing I want to emphasize here, because I'm aware that I'm talking to a room full of, I'm assuming architecture students. There is actually a lot of skills that you learn in architecture and architecture school that means that you're able to traverse between the sort of the visual and the written and the other forms of like visual communication. And I think a big part of this, and I really hope this is, I'm going to emphasize this later on as well, is to be able to communicate complicated ideas, or to be able to communicate things that have a spatial element visually as well as informationally. Anyway, so that's what that looks like. So is there another way? Part of the research was I wanted to look at how does nature actually deal with complexity and contradiction? How can we learn from nature's own understanding, nature's own way of dealing with that, and primarily looking at swarm intelligence, herd intelligence as a way to understand and think about alternatives. Part of this really actually involved doing a lot of reading, which was really exciting. Reading theory, writing by people like Elizabeth Soin, who wrote this incredible book called Multi-Solving, which is about trying to understand in an increasingly fractured and segmented and siloed world, how do we actually connect knowledges up to be able to understand the depths of the issues that we're dealing with. I mean, understanding the depths is not necessarily the problem, it's actually being able to bring those connections together into something productive. Reading classical, seminal texts like Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems, which is a great primer for anyone who's interested in understanding how and why things work in a sort of a systemic perspective. But then also reading some slightly more abstract and tangential thinking around intelligence. What is the idea of intelligence? What does a planetary intelligence look like? We talk about AI quite a lot, but there's actually some really interesting conversations happening within the artificial intelligence circles that are trying to understand what does a non-human intelligence look like, and how can we think about that as a way of even evaluating and improving our own ways of thinking about intelligence. So Benjamin Bratton and at the Antikythera Institute, if anyone's interested in that. And then also just trying to look at research that has tried to map, understand, and put together the relationships that different kinds of intelligence have, be it through sort of swarms, ants and their colonies. I'm not going to spend too long on this. And then also looking at readings from books from people like Giorgio Parisi, and he's a physicist who did a lot of work around like subatomic particles, and then he translated that into research around how we map and understand swarms into starlings. So that's not the right phrase, but then also more practically looking at people, again, Nest has done a little bit of work around this. They have a Center for Collective Intelligence, which tries to understand how do we think about knowledge and how do we think about intelligence differently? How do we connect those things up, and how can we think about democratizing that in a way to be able to influence policy, but also give people more agency in the processes of making decisions. So I then tried to make sense of this, thinking a little bit about knowledge, resource, mapping those through an experience, trying to understand who has knowledge and who has resource, and who has an absence of those, and all of that as part of the research. And then I also did a little bit of thinking around trying to integrate some of this thinking into different ways of organizing government, different departments of government. And then, I'm not sure why this is happening. Okay, all right, fine. So that was, because it was cropped, that's why. Okay, that's fine. So back to this, I should have given you a warning, but back to this map of how the system currently works. What this really kind of looks like in practice was trying to bring together existing ideas rather than trying to completely start from scratch. There's a lot of interesting people who are doing lots of interesting things around streamlining policy, about making policy more accessible, or reducing the sort of load and resource capacity. So that looks like this. That's an alternative, right? And the main moves are in pink. I won't spend too long on this. The idea isn't necessarily to eliminate complexity, it's about managing it and being able to use it as actually a factor, a positive factor rather than a negative one. Complexity isn't inherently a bad thing. Complexity is how the world works. It's just about understanding and eliminating the excess where it's not needed. And so the research was put together into a presentation, so not into an exhibition, which was at the Design Museum, and that was open from June till September. And it was a really interesting opportunity to also bring in people and talk to them about the research and the work that we'd done, me and the other residents, but also to use it as a way to start speaking to people in government who had their own ideas about my research, which I can answer questions about later. Anyway, so to bring it back to you guys, right? Because I think it's really important that you guys are able to situate yourselves within this. For me, I think the most important thing at this stage, I would say, when I was in your position, sitting down and watching someone waffle on about policy, actually, it's really important that you constantly situate yourself within the context that you're in, be it policy or be it other context. Architects are, I think, architects have an incredible opportunity in the future, in making and shaping the future, because we have been trained in a very specific way that gives us general skills that I think actually make us exceptional communicators, but also able to think in parallel, which I think is really important. And this really takes me to the last thing I want to say, which is this idea of pace layering. I think it's a really interesting concept of thinking about how society and the world works. And everything has its own pace, but everything informs the pace of the thing that's above it. I hope it's not too broad. The idea is that the faster paces learn, but the slower paces actually remember. Faster paces propose, slow paces dispose. And the fast is discontinuous, slow is continuous. Fast and small instruct slow and big by accrued innovation and by occasional revolution. And so there's the idea of realizing, okay, well, we don't have to, there's different places for different kinds of thinking, different kinds of innovation. And so this is all open-ended at the moment because I'm still gestating and thinking about what this means, but I've come up with maybe three archetypes that I want to wrap up by and that I think could be useful for people to go forward. First is people like Alistair Parvin, who are, I think, people who are tweaking the system, people who are trying to suggest how can we make the system work better with what we have right now. Alistair's been doing a lot of interesting work with Open Systems Lab around trying to streamline planning applications, digitizing the planning process. Really recommend checking out what they've been doing at Open Systems Lab. And that's really responding to immediate challenges. How do we optimize the current situation? Second, people who test the briefs. This is people who push the system. So Hastings Commons is a great example, but the example that you shared as well, I think is incredible because people who are able to use existing structures around ownership, around rent, around sort of purchase agreements, things like that. I think those people who, when they can actually push the system, can really have a huge amount of impact and actually can really ensure longevity for communities across the world, really, not just the UK. So yeah, I've sort of phrased it as people who use the parts of the system to create islands of safety and resource for others and for themselves. And then the last, which is probably the most out there, I'm going to have to sum this up really quickly because I know I'm just over 20 minutes. I would say people who upend the system. This is a painting of Alexander the Great. There's an old Greek myth about the Gordian knot, which is a knot that was left in a town square. And there was a myth at the time that whoever was able to undo the knot would become the eventual prince or ruler of Asia. And so people were trying to undo this knot for a really long time. And then Alexander the Great realized in the phrasing of the question that it didn't say anything about untying it. So he just took a sword to it. And so that's what I mean by people who upend the system, is people who can actually look forward to the future. This is a much more long-term thing, but how can we actually do some things differently, and how can we actually reach that goal of an alternative? And I think that's something that I think architects are particularly equipped for, but I also think that the other two archetypes that are kind of work in progress are also really important. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Hani. I would now like to invite Blanche for our final keynote speaker of this evening.
I do like that monkey picture.
It is very good.
All right, sorry, I changed the name of the title already. In fact, I couldn't remember what it was that I said it was going to be called, but Student Net Gain is also a good title for this. I'm absolutely thrilled and honoured to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm incredibly impressed always with StuCAN, and you've done a huge amount ever since you set up, which is 2 years. So well done. And I'm going to start by what I'm going to do is try and give you 3 sections that kind of give a bit about what I think is important, being a very old, going deaf, not even an architect, misplaced, chaotic person, and how I came through architecture and developed some teaching and was inspired by studying, being a student, learning education, and then how we applied that. But I'm also a nature freak, and I absolutely feel bereft if I spend too much time indoors. And the whole point about this idea of the natural world as some kind of thing that we manage and manipulate is so nuts that it doesn't even make sense. I think there's a madness in society, and you touched on that at the beginning, Becca, about how everybody lies in the built environment, and I thought that was a very poignant thing to say, and how radical to be able to say things like that. That we rely on nature for everything, and we're not just, nature. We're part of nature. Whether nature is more than human or we're less than nature, I don't know, but I do think that obviously we're deeply and intimately connected, and it's our home. Essentially, nature is our home. So buildings are all very well. I guess this isn't why I didn't become an architect, but I did study architecture at the Mackintosh over the road, in the worst building in the area, the Borden building, looking at the best building in the area, which is still sadly not rebuilt yet, but I'm sure that will come. We're a solar-powered planet. We're pulled by the moon. We're full of water, and we're full of energy. And we share a huge amount of our DNA with the natural world. So trees have been here for at least 400 million years, as far as we've discovered so far. Who knows, maybe longer than that. In our current form, I think we're, a few 100 million years in our making. But all of that R&D and research that has been through nature to show us how to live in equilibrium with the earth. So we all know the earth is largely 2/3 water, but we call it the earth because that's where we stand on it. Oh, that's okay then. And I guess if the dolphins had been naming it, they would have come up with something else. And all species on earth rely on water. You know this. This is me recapping this for me. This is a very self-indulgent talk because I talk about this at the beginning of almost every talk that I do. So you'll... So bear with me, but it's a reminder for myself as well. And hopefully it'll make sense when I come into the next bits. But that water everywhere is obviously a vital, spiritually important, culturally vital. There's nothing in the system that isn't vital. That's the thing. You can't say that water is more important. You can't say humans or different species are more or less important. We're a system that all works together, and it's mind-blowing. You might have come across the Namibian fog beetle. I saw Michael Paulin do a talk about it, creating water in the desert. And this is what nature can teach us so much. Obviously, we talk about biomimicry and biophilic design and so on, but a lot of that is really form making or shape making, and sometimes we need to just revisit what it is to be natural. I thought that was a good question. What is entanglement, isn't it? Is it same as community? Is it different than community? Being in community, we're all entangled. Here's my community back 100 years ago when I was a student here, and Salih was my teacher, and a brilliant one at that. And the school was a mixture of modernism, there's some crazy people who were absolutely going full on for concrete modernism, lovely white concrete buildings. Andy and Izzy, who were spectacular in many ways as teachers. At least you could have a good argument with them because they believed really strongly in what they did. But we fought. I mean, we really fought. And I was part of the Student Society, and we did lots of actions and demos. And then when I finished at Bartlett, at Mackintosh, I went to work in Berlin. I joined an architect's practice, and within 3 weeks, I realised that was definitely not for me. The reason I'm also saying this is because some of you will go on and become many other things, and architecture is definitely not by any means the be-all and end-all in life. But having a training in architecture is incredibly interesting and sometimes even valuable. And then I went to work as a builder at the Centre for Alternative Technology because I stayed there. I worked in that practice for 6 months. Then I taught English for a bit, and I thought, what do I really love? I love being outside. I like working with materials. I'll go to CAT. Someone's told me about it, and I ended up there for almost 10 years as a builder, first of all, and then as part of the Graduate School of the Environment that we developed over the next 8 or 9 years that I was involved with that, teaching master's courses, and there's some students here today, and obviously went there last year with the StuCAN Festival. And during that time, I found community, and I think the point about this is who's your client, and the first part is that nature is your client. You do what nature tells you to do naturally. Try to do it. Try to be a good public servant, I guess. And then community with each other. How can we make things together? And so that's when I was starting to find ways to use some skills to work with community and provide small buildings like this. The Roundhouse, if you want, the best self-build book I've ever read is by Tony Wrench. It's called Low Impact Living, Building a Roundhouse, and it's a direct manual. There are loads of others, of course, but it's immediately useful. And doing the same in other parts of the world. This was in Washington as part of the Smithsonian Folklife Festival, and working with parents and children from a local school to build a roundhouse. And we built it, and then on the last day, they came and took it down in about 4 hours, put it on the back of a flatbed, drove it to the school, and had it rebuilt by sunset. And that was spectacular, really. The idea that we can not just reuse, but reinvigorate. And then they added to it, and they put in cordwood walls and a green roof and all kinds of things. One of them actually was a rocket scientist. Some of the kids came in flip-flops. I'm sure I would not get away with this now. I shouldn't even have got away with it then, but nobody cared, and it was lovely, and probably we were just very lucky. This was also on that same part of that festival. I love this photo. Dusty Gedge is internationally recognised as a green roof expert, and here he is plug planting something without a safety harness, I suppose. Ed Snodgrass is one of the US's largest green roof plant nursery growers. And that guy on the right, David Masters from Oberlin, I must look up what happened to him. A very brilliant guy. Anyway, making these things and having fun doing it and finding some kind of role of exploration, I think it was. We're just trying stuff out, just seeing what happened. We didn't know. I didn't know. And it was a whole group of people interested in this and doing it together. And there was a conference there at the same time. So I did a talk about it, and now I'm doing a talk about doing a talk. So there we are. This was testing out straw bale and seeing whether the Guardian would like it or not. So they commissioned me to design and then build a media centre for the Hay Festival in 2009. And it was very attractive to people, and lots of photos taken in front of it, and could all be dismantled afterwards. I guess I love seeing things come and go. I think that transience, I think things that pretend to be permanent are challenging. Perhaps I struggle with that. So this guy, he gave a lecture at the Bartlett recently, and but he's very old like me, and he has researched the problems, the harm, the disappointment of architecture, the disappointment of the built environment, and the issues and problems that have come up year after year. He's an architectural historian, and in his talk, he talked about he found through his research that the thing always came back to the same three things: ignorance, carelessness, and greed. And ignorance, okay, fine, you don't know. And maybe you don't even know that you don't know. But carelessness means that you don't know and you don't care. And greed means I don't know, I don't care, and I'm going to make money off of it. So, and he said from the collapse of bridges to Grenfell, these were the same issues that came up time and time and time again. So you could see it running through problems. And I think that's fascinating, not in a sort of blamey way, but, I'm a very ignorant, very clumsy and pretty careless person, and, quite greedy. Anyway, in many ways. So at the Bartlett, what that sort of spun into, wasn't that moment in 2018, before the lockdowns, there were millions of people on the street in all parts of the world demonstrating about a change, wanting a better future, a more livable, equitable future. And at the Bartlett, we occupied the reception desk. Students occupied the reception desk for 6 weeks until the Bartlett agreed to sign, with a petition, hundreds of signatures, to make a declaration. And schools at that time were doing that all over the country, all over the world. And architecture education declare set up. For a few years, that existed as a wonderful campaign thing. And it's now really what StuCAN is doing in an even better and broader way. So that was good. At the same time, there were students down at Trafalgar Square building with U-Block a defensible protest structure, which could be moved and reassembled very quickly because the police were chasing. Not just students, all sorts of protesters, but there were students from all sorts of architecture schools at that. The writing of this was quite important because it had to acknowledge, which has not really, a lot of focus on carbon, emissions, and climate change is caused by carbon and carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. It's partly true, but it's not the whole truth. And there are a lot of lies involved in the carbon markets and net zero and all the rest of it about how if we do this, this will save the world. That's not true. We can save all the carbon in the world and not make it because we haven't restored our ecosystems and our natural world. So the Student Society set up and that was in 2021 or so. We had started it before COVID, but then obviously that interrupted quite a lot, although it was kept going through that time by some amazing students at the school. And now they organise all kinds of events and workshops, and some of it is like this summer school at Orchard Barn in Suffolk, where students go and get hands-on building experience every year, and it's free. And that's important. The cost of studying is bonkers to begin with, and then the idea that you can just turn up and not know how much a field trip is going to be this year. What's that about? Turn up with a blank check. Yes, and as you mentioned there at the beginning, I set up this module called Greening Cities in 2019. That's running now, and that's open to students across UCL to learn about nature-based solutions to the climate crisis and to climate adaptation. And we work with people like Dusty Gage, Gary Grant. Oh, it's missed one of the pictures. Has it? Yes, it has. It doesn't matter. With some incredible people who come in and talk about the industry the part of the industry that they're working in. So Wendy Allen, who's a biodiverse suds designer, Carol Wright, who's an urban activist and gardener and community garden manager. Who else is on there? Benny Hawksby, who's an incredible incredible invertebrate specialist who to the nth degree, but is the loveliest, and I say but because, you know, entomologists, you talk to them, they say it's like living in a world of pain. You're looking down a microscope, everything's eating each other all the time. So it's a nightmare, but if you want to get into something and understand how nature, pick an insect life cycle, it'll blow your mind. And we go to places that are inspiring to encourage us to think and look differently at the landscape and the world around us. So aesthetics, I think, is a big problem because it becomes, it's either fashion version of aesthetics, in which case it has to be different all the time just to be different, or it's something where the aesthetics must look like that. That's what it's always looked like, and that's what it always should look like. We've always done it that way. You know, one of the worst sort of phrases in the human language, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, everything is needing fixing. So looking at wild spaces is sometimes, it's lovely, but I don't want to look at it all the time when I go back to the city. So there is not that everybody feels like that, but I think there's a lot of resistance in the system, which is down to things like maintenance. And we spend money on capital projects, but we don't invest in people. We need lots of gardeners. If we're going to manage a natural environment and a natural world for biodiversity, and not just trimming and trimming, we need gardeners and landscape maintenance contractors and people and community groups and all sorts of, who know how to look after biodiverse environments and places. So that's why we go out there, and then students are working and making stuff and producing structural habitat. So you need you need the bed as well as the breakfast. The plants are the breakfast, but you need the bed as well if you're going to create a B&B for insects. So structural habitat is where insects lay eggs. And I'm talking about insects so much because they're the foundational food source, as you know, for terrestrial life, like the krill in the ocean. So the insects, you get everything else if you can provide homes for insects. There's a picture of Marius over there, talking to John Little, who's a brilliant biodiverse public realm designer now, who's been running his garden like a 30-year university research centre for free, basically. He just does it because he's a gardener and he loves nature, but he's also a brilliant designer. And trying to crack that nut of bringing the wild into the public realm in cities. And then it's important to know what's around you. So we walk around the estate of UCL and Bloomsbury and the University of London, and we're always looking at these places, but there's so much opportunity to provide habitats for nature. And we found one, and it was round the back of a small meditation space, and Hannah Biggs, who's in there, she said to me, I found the perfect place, Blanche. No one will care. It's round the back. It's like being round the back of the bike sheds. And she was absolutely right. Nobody stopped us doing it. We're in a conservation area in Bloomsbury. You need planning permission until your eyes are burning, as Hani said. You know, I mean, if we'd had to apply for, but she said, no, it's a small building, it's a temporary structure, and it's basically a planter. So this is a rain planter designed by the students with Wendy Allen, who's that brilliant woman there. And then we installed it, so students install and then maintain also these interventions. But it takes an incredible long time, even to get to this point. There it is, planting it all up. And we had to install it in one day, because that was all the time that we had for the people who were available to help us. So it was a long day. We had about 30 students involved. And basically what I should say is that all things from the Greening Cities module to all the work that we do to the visits to Hilldrop and so on, that has been driven by students asking for it. My role is to ask students continuously, what do you want to learn about? What do you want to do? Because there's no point it's your time, it's your education, it's your turn, and you are, anyway, in charge, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you pay the fees, there wouldn't be any universities or schools if you weren't around. You're the boss, you're not the client, you're in charge. And you won't necessarily hear that in every school, but I loved what Salih said at the beginning and how dedicated she is, obviously, to making the school what you want it to be in Glasgow. Fabulous. So this Wild Bloomsbury plan and programme, that started around 2017. It took until 2022, even just to get a plan of action through UCL, but these things take time, I guess. And then, oh, it's coming. I think it's just taking, oh no, maybe I just missed a slide. So we did an infrastructure audit. Gary Grant and Dusty Gage wrote the Wild Bloomsbury plan, looking at opportunities. So that's the top of that Institute of Education building where we were before. And that green wall that's on the right there, that's on the chemistry building next to the architecture school, and that's actually going up at the moment. So what is it now? 2026, started in 2017. 9 years? That's okay. We're probably going to make it, aren't we? We'll get there. If that's the rate of change, I'm sure everything's fine. Don't worry, just relax. And I also wanted to talk about some other student-led projects. There's two which I'll just go into, and then we can have a chat, and I'll sit down. But the first two are related. Founders Keepers was an initiative that was started through by a couple of students, Marius Hiderovicius and Harangxio, and also Kingsley Liu. I have to mention him just for the joke, because he was involved really early on, and then every time there was a report, it was about him, but he was involved in a very beautiful way. I don't know why I'm making a joke about it, really. And Hannah Simon, who joined also so they were studying the Architectural and Interdisciplinary Studies degree, and they were in second year. You were in second year. Marius is here. He's doing a workshop tomorrow with Hannah, the Resource 12 Circular Materials workshop. So do go along to that if you fancy it. And then this second year that's just gone with Rish and John, who also from that AIS programme. Hannah was from architecture, but the whole school uses it. And what was really miraculous about it was this is about going around the studios, collecting waste and putting it in a free shop. That's it, basically. It's literally all it is. There's so much waste in architecture schools, in design, art schools and all the rest of it, as there is in life. So that was all it was. But the way that they designed it, the way that they presented it, made it look like Ryman's. It was awesome, and it was instantly successful. And you know that when something takes off straight away, it's because it's been waiting for that opportunity to happen, and you know it's just going to run and run. So there are students who have come up through third year who were saying to Harang the other day that they don't know how they would have got through the school without Founders Keepers, because it's free materials and materials cost a bomb. And if you've got a design tutor saying to you, you have to go and buy this and you must use that and make a swanky model out of it, and I don't want to see anything else but those materials, and you're going like, I think I might just go and get something from the free shop, if you don't mind. But that opportunity wasn't really there before, and I think there's a lot of pressure on students to, it's expensive enough. Do you see the cost of the books? And mind you probably, but the libraries are good, obviously you have to use libraries too. But when that Founders Keepers project was happening, it was also their final year. And quite remarkably, they all graduated, and really well. And then they decided to set up a community interest company called Resource 12, which is called after the SDG 12, which is the Natural Resources SDG, and has within it the circularity and the reuse aspect. And I can't wait to see what they do next, but I've seen what they've done this year, which is that they applied to the UCL Hatchery and got some free workspace for a couple of years and some mentoring and training, and have been running workshops at the RIBA, at Cambridge University, and all sorts of other places, and now here, and working on some other things I'll show you in a second. But the reason I'm showing you this is because of this thing. Are you going to become an architect, or what are you going to do? Who knows? There are so many ways to be active in the world that is joyful and fun and meaningful. And I think that it makes the world, it makes all the built environment things that we talk about so much better than them focusing on maybe one potential outcome, which I don't think anybody studying does actually, but I do think there's an assumption. Let's pretend that you're all going to become architects until you've graduated and your fees are paid. But I don't think actually probably a lot of schools don't talk about it like that. But it's the fear in my head, I think, this perpetuation of the guru architect and what we can do to change that. Sorry about, I hate animations, but never mind. So this is the other project that is led by students and comes out of conversations of looking around the campus and wanting to change it and make it more biodiverse. So the University of London started a process to set up a living lab, which is where you test stuff in the real world, and a nature-based living lab, in this case, and allocated us some spaces. They've got a big landscape program going on to improve landscape, and we've been wheedling, or she had wheedled out some spaces within the big landscape project by a big landscape architect, who I have to say are not interested in biodiversity at all. And in fact, they hate the fact that we have a living lab project going on and want to put in structural habitats for insects and wildlife and things like that. And I think there's for two reasons. It's not just they don't know about it, there is ignorance and carelessness there, but it also that it challenges their role. Now, if all you see, this is what I mean about the visuals, if all you see in front of you is a homogeneous kind of landscape that looks like something it ought to look like, yes, that's what you expect. University of London, Senate House probably should have some nice evergreens and some planters and some nice seating and things like that. You don't know what you're not seeing. And I think that's what's so amazing about the creative skills training, architecture and all the other ones, about being able to imagine something that's not yet there. And that actually is our role. And it's what you were talking about, a regenerative future, imagining what's not there yet. But also being able to see things that aren't there, to be able to understand what ought to be there. And I think that's very difficult. I think it's incredibly difficult, even if you are an artistic-y sort of person. And sometimes, and now that means then helping other people to see. If you can, or you think you can, then obviously the next step is not to castigate anyone for not being able to do that, but it's to help them see something that might not be, or even to find the way of seeing something that isn't there. I mean, you could call it hallucinating, and maybe that's a different thing. Perhaps that's why I like it so much, but anyway, all relates. Everything is connected, isn't it? It's very true. So we've been designing, so the workshop students designed some structural habitats supported by people like John Little and Carol Wright and brilliant Liz Morley at Nottingham College, who's wilding the college campuses there. There's 8 campuses that she's wilding now. She's incredible. She's You Dig Gardens on Instagram. John Little is at Grassroof Co. I can send some links afterwards if you like. We did an event at the Senate House which students chaired, and various speakers came along. We had over 100 people there. It was very lovely. We produced a lookbook with the proposals in them. Number of pages. I won't show you the whole document. Don't need that. But some ideas about structural habitat that could also look a bit funky. The orange is pretty nice, isn't it? So why not have a joyous colour or two in there? Nature doesn't mind. You can make it as colourful as you like. And then they've been making, starting to make things like the Bug Hotel. And these are hardwoods, a whole mixture of hardwoods that we can then label up and use as a bit of a materials library at the same time, talk about sweet chestnut or elm. and so on. So, yeah, I think this entanglement thing about what it made me wonder about, and what I've been talking about, is this idea of community and working together and collaboration, which is not a new idea at all. But I think understanding that we're all connected and work together, I think at this point in time we need courage to speak truth to power and hold people to account. I don't think it's enough to just get along. I'm sorry to say that that's not enough anyway, I think, in life. There's always issues, even at a micro level, with your family or whoever. So it's lovely to get along. I heard a quote once, if you're married and you have 20% of the time or 10% of the time things are okay, you're probably doing all right. So where is this expectation of comfortability? I think that's a very middle-classy kind of idea of the world, and a bit alien when you can have so much fun changing things, but change is very difficult. So, and the other thought, this student net gain, something that John Little came up with during the workshops, just came out of his mouth, but is brilliant. The idea that what we can do, what everybody can do together, benefits students more, the more that we do regenerative work that, you know, replaces anxiety about the future with action for the future. I think that is really important, and I'm thrilled to be here, and that's what the StuCAN Festival weekend is going to be all about, and I'm going to learn a lot. So thank you very much for inviting me.
That's all right. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We will now begin our slightly shorter Q&A session. So if I could invite all the speakers back up. I'll be in the chair on, yeah, thank you. And on the screen is the QR code for the website, which has, I think, the programme and any extra information about this weekend. And you can also join the Festival Comms group chat.
I've been reliably informed that this is a mic for questions, and I've also been informed that it's soft if I throw it. So,
Wow.
I know, it's technology. So if anyone wants to be the guinea pig for the first question, let me know. Over there, okay, that's not too far to throw. Fantastic. You ready? Oh. It's a bit of a wind in the room, I think, tonight.
Testing. Yep, works. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say that was a really fantastic cross-section of speakers. Really appreciated the design for people ethos that Becca started with, and then the zoom out to systems, and you see this macro level, and again, the people aspect of Blanche's slide. I think just a question for Hani, but it kind of touches on everything. Blanche, you mentioned we invest in capital, but we don't invest in people. Hani, you obviously have identified the systems that affect the development that we are all responsible for. And in many ways, that's the upstream systems that are connected to architecture. But really, I think the themes that we've explored have been more about the downstream systems and how that the people are affected by those systems. And quite often, people who are affected don't see those systems, or they're not aware of them, or they're not literate in the complexities. Just wondered in your specific research whether you had Like, was there any opportunity to go downstream as well?
That's a very good question. I didn't have a huge amount of time for the research when I was in the residency. I think that my attempt was to try and just demonstrate how the system isn't just not working. I think when it comes to downstream, I feel like maybe this. There was an interview clip in the presentation that would have maybe showed this a little bit, but the downstream is people. It's not just architects who are trying to navigate this. You know, there's people who just their boiler goes conk, and it's like the middle of the winter, and they go, okay, well, I've always wanted to switch to a more environmentally friendly and potentially cheaper energy alternative, and then they try to do it, and it's going to take them like 3 months, and no one can really afford to use electric space heaters for 3 months, let alone just sit in the cold. And so, like, I think the downstream of it is actually like it is affecting people in a very real way, in that they aren't able to, whether it is through ideological or like genuine like economic reasons, they can't actually do the simple thing of trying to just improve the quality of their life effectively. Yeah.
I might pick up on this. I've actually, I was revisiting a conversation I had last year, because I'm finally finishing a podcast episode on it. But we talked a lot in that. It was an interview with Kinning Park and with Old School Thornhill, who are two community groups who've done that kind of pushing through the system thing in Scotland. And in both cases, we were having a conversation about what it means to be a client. I think it touched on what you were saying, like so much of that space, the money for the capital, the money for the exciting building, you know, getting the doors open, that's the thing everyone's focused on. That's the thing the support is there for. And then the minute you get to figure out what your organization is doing, keep the lights on for the next 10, 20 years, that bit doesn't have any funding. It's a structural gap in the system. And we're often working with the groups that you've highlighted, right? They go, I need to make change, but I can't afford your expertise to make that change. I shouldn't need your expertise to make this change, but I do, and now I can't afford to get it because I have to pay my staff, I have to do all those things, so we have to make it work within a kind of capitalist system. But ultimately, I'd love to be able to give that out for free. It's just that it's really difficult to figure out the systems to allow me to do that. So I think all of this is the downstream of these broken systems is the thing that I think so many of us are trying to like tweak and poke at and push and prod until we can create the space to do the things we want to do.
I would just. I'm so lazy. I can't even. Okay. I was going to say, the who pays for what is absolutely critical question, and you touched on that a lot, Hani, and it was very interesting to see you trying to unpick. It's the golden ticket, isn't it? How do you get somebody to pay for something? With nature-based solutions, there's an interesting thing happening. That one of the last things that Mark Carney did before he left the Bank of England to become ruler of the world, starting with Canada, was to set up the Climate Task Force for Declaration on Carbon and Nature. And regarding nature and climate resilience, there is now a requirement on all large real estate owners to declare their climate resilience of their asset in their end-of-year accounts. Now, what that means is that if you have shareholders, if you own a £2 billion housing estate like Thamesmead, Peabody owns Thamesmead in southeast London, and it's not climate resilient, your insurers will then be able to say to you, well, we're going to increase your premium because you're more likely to have outages of energy, overheating, having to evacuate, or you're more likely to flood. You've got all kinds of risks you haven't addressed, naughty you, big business person, big real estate owner. And maybe worse, we've seen it in California with the wildfires, they will not insure you at all, in which case you will end up with a stranded asset. So what is really genius about that technical mechanism of finance, and I'm looking at this in some work with UCL and Swansea University and Trinity St David, is that unpicking those, how do we get someone to pay for it? Because climate adaptation through nature-based solutions is a retrofit issue. So you can have all the policy in the world for new builds, and about retrofit, okay, and we have some legislation on retrofit, but we don't have a mandated But this is how we will green towns and cities all over the world, is because we won't get insurance or it'll be more expensive.
I just want to jump in on this as well. So some of the other, outside of the Design Museum, I've been doing quite a bit of research on health and health policy and how it affects how the environment that we live in affects our health, right? That's a big strand of that came out after the pandemic when everyone's stuck inside. They realized, oh my God, and the 50-minute cities came and then went for reasons we won't get into. But I think that actually this idea of, just because my brain's sort of kicking into gear with this, the idea of who funds what, sometimes actually knowledge of systems allows you to understand where you can create areas of connection overlap. So actually some of the research I've been doing around like how do we improve community health infrastructure, local community health infrastructure by tapping into existing capacity on the ground. Some of that you can actually tie back into the downstream impacts of that are improved health, but also improved environmental qualities. And so actually what a lot of the work that I'm doing outside of that research, which is fed by that research, is trying to make the connections across the different funding pots where there's actually a bit more money on this and less money on that. Well, we can actually, because of the multiplier effect, because of the fact that this will have that impact. So I think that's why I'm really, really encouraging people to think about systems, because they're all interrelated. And this is what I mean by entanglement in my perspective. And this is why I keep saying context, situating yourself in the context is important. If you understand the system, you can really actually understand where the connections are.
I think that's why those of us who are working within social enterprise or connected practice or regenerative practice, it's probably why so many of us as designers talk about money, economics, land policy, governance, which sound like huge, boring things to get a handle on. But actually, it took me probably 10 years to figure out that if I could make those things work for us, then we could do all the interesting stuff, all the design stuff, all the outcome stuff that we wanted to do, without an understanding of the underpinning of how decisions are actually made in the built environment. Those decisions are economic almost exclusively as a starting point, and that land as an economic tool is the thing that we're working with. So if we can't make a good case for the economics of, or the benefit for the economics of the change, we will struggle to get the people who don't care yet about what we're talking about to join us. If we can make an economic case for us, they will be on it, like absolutely, because that's a good reason for them to do it then. But the metrics that we're working with, and this is why then we all talk about this so much, is the metrics have to meet those metrics, their metrics, not our metrics, to allow us to make change. And that's why I talk about land policy a lot.
On the topic of land, I had a quick question for all of you, because I think you all kind of touched on this a little bit. But how, like you mentioned that architecture is destructive, and the things that we do to the land, how we take out resources and stuff will affect that landscape. So how do we shift land from something that is owned and built upon and extracted from to something that is more stewarded and more sort of co-cared for?
We have to break the system. It's a difficult thing to do. I think if we want to keep working within this system and tweaking this system, what we have to get to is that point of understanding land as valuable, not economically, but for what it delivers and what it brings to a project. And not something that you can bank, hold on to, sit on, wait for. It's something that should be actively used and managed. I think we're beginning to get there with some of the stuff around biodiversity net gains and understanding that brownfield sites have biodiversity. And so removing, or can have biodiversity. Scott's giving me a funny face as I said that. By stripping that out to build a new building or to put in a new development might look really good on paper, but actually we're losing biodiversity because we're not working hard enough. So I think we have to understand land as having completely different value to the value that we give it right now to make that change.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would really point to the last one. I mean, I showed a lot of diagrams, I know, but the pace layers one is a really important one, because actually we're operating on different paces in different parts of society. I think the question of like what we value is a societal question. So how do we rewire society, like our own understandings of value, to be able to be more encompassing of the things that we talk about, the things that we really need to be reacting to right now? And I think a lot of it is demonstrating it's possible. I think the projects like yours and projects like yours are really good, because what you're able to do is you're able to show how people can directly go out and do things. So I think that's the beginning of that cultural shift. But I also think we need an entirely new kind of imagination. I think that we don't have any viable. I mean, this is going to wade into like some political territory, but I do think that there isn't a viable like tangible and genuinely quite inspiring imagination for what a future could look like under a progressive like vision for politically, an actual progressive vision. I think it's all a little bit fragmented. And I think people need to feel like they are inspired by things that affect them materially, directly, locally. And so again, that's why projects are really important as a way of being able to show it. And like you may feel like islands, but actually once enough islands are there, people realize that they can just build bridges between them. And there's some work I'm doing with another organization in London, but they work nationally, called Footwork Trust. And what they do is they do a lot of funding. They basically provide funding, but also they have an emerging mycelial network of local community innovators. These are people who are actively working in the local context to try and bring about positive social change through spatial methods, be it through owning a community asset, so owning a building and then running it as a community, or even like trying to bring an asset into community ownership and then using that as a way to activate. So I think it's like an imagination, but it's tangible that I'm seeing it happen. We just need to keep going.
I think those from not a Scottish context, obviously the Scottish legal system for things like community asset purchases or transfers is really different to the one in England. So there are some differences there in terms of how we might talk about or think about land use from a Scottish context than coming from kind of England or London. And I think those are really interesting to kind of get into, and maybe students kind of coming across the weekend, bringing that understanding from your own context would be really interesting, because the slight but real differences between the cultures and contexts of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are there, and actually they're another place where those silos kind of fall down. That you were talking about, that kind of diagram. I think you could take that as the four nations of the UK, and there's also massive gaps between some of the ways in which it's handled. You know, the planning context you were talking about is not the one that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, but there's some relationships. So yeah, I think the lessons are still there to learn between them. And see where some are working harder or having more progressive conversations than others, and where we can bring everyone up to the same place.
I'm afraid I've forgotten what the question is. See, the benefit of being really old is you don't have to work as hard as you used to sort of follow conversations, and I've got all sorts of nice thoughts drifting through my head. One of them, which is how many of the audience are coming to the festival over the weekend? Can you raise your hands? Oh yeah, like most of you. That's brilliant. How exciting. And who isn't coming yet? Oh no, just a joke. Get him. Yeah, the reason I was asking that is it's very nice hearing ourselves talk, but if you've got questions as well, I'd love to reach out to hear them. But the reason I was asking that is if you are going to be here all weekend, then okay. You might not want to ask a question now. So.
One more question?
That's right, I'm not going to get that far. I'll try.
Hi, I'm a landscape architecture student from Leeds, and I was wondering how, in practice, I'm supposed to keep biodiversity of the surrounding area when working with a client who has certain needs and objectives for said area within the community. And I was wondering how you, as people in that work, would go about it, tips on it.
I think for me, I'm not a practicing landscape architect, but we do a lot of work kind of around and with landscape architects. I think for me, a huge part of that is managing that client and making sure that both, you know what they want. They've told you what they want. And then if you're adding value by connecting out into wider biodiversity networks, into other things, if you're talking about blue and green infrastructures, how do you show them that that's better for them, rather than them thinking that you're just coming with this kind of, artsy, creative idea, right? So you need to show that that has genuine value to them as well. And then also sometimes, and close your ears, anyone who's working in practice, sometimes you can also just do that stuff without telling them. If it's not going to cost them any more money, just do that stuff, make the connections, make it part of the design so that it's embedded in it as well. Because I think part of what we're trying to figure out is how do you use the system that we have to our best example. So yeah, thinking about that at the beginning and embedding it in your design also means that if you were to strip it out, it's both more expensive and more difficult.
I think you demonstrated brilliantly with your talk how much extra work you have to do if you really care about stuff. And caring about stuff is really important, so that Professor Adrian Forty doesn't come and hunt us down and tell us we're ignorant, careless and greedy. But the point about that is, I think there's a bit more, which is when something has been designed and installed, that's the beginning of its life. That's maybe the end of your relationship to it, but obviously it's clearly not as well in your case. And many people go on being involved, but they're unusual, those projects. But that's the start of its life. So it is fine not to tell people, but at some point you want to say, look, we've had a baby. I know I hid it really well,
the rest of the watercourse.
Who's going to feed it? And, look after it. And that's really important. That's really important. So if we are taking all of this seriously and not fooling ourselves, then we genuinely have to do a huge amount of extra. Genuinely, most of it is unpaid. But what you're doing is educating yourself. So I don't often do talks in architecture practices, but I happened to be doing one the other day at Zaha Hadid. So I just dropped that in there. Salih, she was brilliant. And people in practices often say, look, I want to change the system, but we get these projects. The client has the money. We do what we're told. There's a limited amount. At the end of the day, I've got to draw details until midnight anyway. So what can I do? And I think the thing that I always say is set up start a sort of mini ACAN in your practice. Educate, do something at lunchtime, organise toolbox talks that aren't people flogging another handle for bathrooms, and get some people in to come and talk about the things that you want to learn about. Make it your school, lifelong education. We never, if we're not learning, we shouldn't be earning. Something I said to my ex-head of school one time. It's like, where's the CPD? So this is investing in ourselves is really important. And I think you can double up a lot as well. I think, when you think that's over there and that's an additional job, try and make it part of something you're already doing. That's the only advice. Otherwise you get exhausted pretty quickly, kind of thing.
Tell the right story. So yeah, if you're embedding it in, tell them why. Tell them what it's doing, and make it so that they think they've had a great idea.
Now that I do definitely agree with. Definitely.
Yeah. We're going to definitely helps.
To you.
I think I would really echo what you guys have said. I think it's one of my last, when I was before the residency, I was working as a senior researcher where I was doing that health research, and I would often be talking to developers, really big developers who are saying, I'd do the research, speak to people who live in the developments, and then we'd come back and say, okay, their quality of life is relatively good compared to national averages, but here's where it could be improved, because that would have a positive impact on their health, mental health, and their physical well-being. And one of the things that always come up is like access to leisure, right? Like people would say, we wish we had a pub locally, because that's like a hub for a lot of like social life outside of the city, right? If you live in your local pub is your main point. And so then the developer would say, okay, but I've already sold all these houses. Why would I spend 2, 3, 4, 5 million pounds building a pub in this local area? I've already got extracted as the value. And so what we had to do is we had to sit there and explain to them, as exactly as you say, like why that is actually a benefit. And what I've been describing it as is like translating value across different value systems, right? For them, they're interested in their bottom line. But actually, if you're able to develop your own understanding of different systems and their incentive structures, you can try to use that to make the connections in the same way that I was saying earlier, right? So for me, I would say very tangentially, I don't have a huge depth of understanding of economics, but I can waffle enough that I think it sounds convincing. So what I said to them was, well, if you think about it long term, if your residents are happier with the social infrastructure offer, they're less likely to leave, they're less likely to settle, they're less likely to move on. Churn is something that all developers want to avoid. And then there's also further down the line, you're thinking about reputational gains, and you don't have to be precise, but as you say, you have to sell a convincing narrative. And then that becomes a much more easier conversation. It won't convince them. Changing people's minds takes a long time. You have to be incredibly consistent with your message. You have to be incredibly consistent in how it touches in the material context that you're speaking to, both for clients, for community members, for developers, for the government. But you just have to be consistent, and you have to know the really positive impact of connecting those things up.
Yeah, very good. And I think in landscape architecture, there are a lot of really amazing references, and part of that educating yourself is building your archive of great references to show them other projects that are like this, because it's this thing of not being able to see what isn't yet there. And if you can engage your client with the idea of what something might look like and give them not just your own drawings, but other people's projects, it's much easier that way. And then I think in terms of maintenance, we really do need better education for gardeners and prioritising people. We need to flip the hierarchy. We need to elevate the carers of our natural system, so that, you know, nurses, teachers, cleaners, gardeners, and so on. But while that's happening, I think pointing out the ways that it could be maintained, so you can have not a zero maintenance space, but you can have a low maintenance biodiverse space, but it must be maintained. So then you work with whoever's going to be maintaining it, the landscape maintenance contractors or whoever it is, not volunteers. It has to be paid for. And then you go, okay, and I will train one of their team so that, okay, the trimming and strimming can all happen in those areas, but somebody in that team will have the knowledge and, you know, understand. I'll write a separate maintenance contract for the biodiversity areas. And you don't, nothing has to be everywhere, what's that film?
Everything everywhere all at once.
That sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
So
it is a lot.
Maybe something somewhere in due course or something. I don't know, but it doesn't.
That's a nice sequel.
Have to be big. Yeah. It can be. Nature will come in very, very quickly, and what we want is diversity of species. So do check that you're adding to the existing flora and fauna, because just because something is biodiverse doesn't mean that those species aren't already there. So
That's a lovely note to leave it on. I'm afraid. I'm so sorry.
Sorry to talk
we
so
have
long.
to pause here. If you guys do have any more questions, there might be an opportunity to ask them when we go up to the refectory or during this weekend. But thank you so much for your, I guess, practical advice for how to entangle in real life. And I think we'll pause it there. Thank you.
And my
Let's go this one.